There is a library on the US-Canada border where a black line runs straight across the floor. The front door is in Vermont. The circulation desk and the books are in Quebec. And the reading room itself sits on both sides of an international boundary. But this isn't a normal border crossing, and the rules around this strange building have changed dramatically in recent years. Welcome to one of the strangest borders on Earth. Most people picture a border as a wall, a checkpoint, a place where soldiers stand with rifles and dogs sniff your trunk. That's the border most Americans know, the one to the south. But the border to the north is something else entirely. It's the longest border between two countries anywhere in the world, stretching about 525 miles from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. And along Alaska's frontier with Canada. And for most of that distance, it isn't a wall at all. It's a scar in the landscape. Literally running through forests from Maine to Washington state is something surveyors call the Vista, a 20-foot wide strip of cleared land that follows the border for thousands of miles, cutting through mountains. Swamps and wilderness so remote that no road has ever reached it. The boundary was first surveyed and marked during the 19th century, but forests quickly swallowed many of those old markers. So in the 20th century, the two countries created a permanent body, the International Boundary Commission, whose job, to this day, is simply to keep that line visible, clearing the trees that keep trying to grow back over it. From space, you can actually see it, a thin, deliberate line slicing across North America, visible in satellite photography as a border that exists not because of concrete, but because of grass. And here's the part that surprises people. For most of its length, this border has no fence and no wall. In many remote stretches, there isn't a staffed checkpoint in sight. But that doesn't mean it's an open crossing. The cleared strip isn't a neutral zone. The moment you step across it, you've entered another country, and travelers are still required to follow immigration and reporting rules, even out in the wilderness. Which makes what happens in some border towns even stranger. Because this is a border that runs not just through forests and mountains, but straight through people's kitchens. Welcome to Derby Line, Vermont, and its twin town, Stansted, Quebec. On a map, they look like one single town. On the ground, they basically are. The international border runs directly through Main Street, through backyards, and most famously through the Haskell Free Library and Opera House. Built in 1904, the Haskell was designed on purpose to straddle two nations, a literal gift of unity between American and Canadian donors. Walk inside today, and you'll see a black line of tape marking the border across the floor. The front entrance is in Vermont, while the circulation desk and the books themselves sit in Quebec. The reading room and the Opera House stage upstairs straddle the line directly, a building where the boundary isn't a wall between two countries, but the floor plan itself. For decades, this arrangement worked on a quiet handshake of trust. Life in Derby Line and Stansted revolved around a border that was physically easy to cross, but legally very real, even when it felt informal. That informality has been shrinking for a long time, and recently, it changed again. After the September 11th attacks in 2001, security along the northern border intensified. Cameras Buried sensors and increased patrols became part of a landscape that had previously felt almost invisible. For a community like Derby Line, the shift was impossible to ignore, because everyday life had long depended on a border that people crossed constantly without thinking about it. And as of October 2025, the change reached the Haskell itself. The sidewalk that once connected the library directly between the two countries was permanently closed, with only a limited exemption for visitors who need it for accessibility. The library is now explicit on the point: it is not an official border crossing. American visitors are expected to enter and exit through the U.S. entrance. Canadian visitors use the Canadian side. No passport is required simply to walk in and read a book, but border authorities can still enforce immigration law around it. It's a place where the geography never changed a building straddling two nations, exactly as it was built to do, but where the rules about what you're allowed to do inside that geography keep shifting with the times. If you think Derby Line is strange, meet Point Roberts, Washington, an American community that exists thanks to a quirk of 19th century treaty making and geography. In 1846, when the United States and Britain divided the Pacific Northwest through the Oregon Treaty, they agreed on a simple rule. The border would follow the 49th parallel straight across the continent. The negotiators knew exactly where that line would fall. What they got, almost as a side effect, was a small peninsula hanging off the bottom of a larger Canadian landmass, whose tip happened to dip just south of that line, putting it in the United States, while the only route to it by land runs through Canada. The result, Point Roberts is American soil. Roughly 1,300 people live there, pay U.S. taxes, and fly the American flag. But there's a catch. To drive there from the rest of the United States, you cannot simply take a road. You must first drive into Canada, cross about 25 miles of Canadian territory, and then cross back into the United States a second time, just to reach a town that's still technically part of Washington State. Point Roberts does have its own small school, a primary school teaching the youngest kids. But once students get older, there's no high school on the peninsula. It's simply not large enough to justify one. So older students cross into Canada and back into the US as part of their daily commute, just to get to school in Blaine, Washington, because the community is surrounded by Canadian territory on its landward side. Local services from emergency response to deliveries to something as simple as trick-or-treating on Halloween all depend on close, constant coordination with a neighboring country. It's not the only place like this. Alaska is separated from the rest of the US entirely, obviously, but lesser known is the Northwest Angle in Minnesota, the northernmost point in the contiguous United States, whose normal road connection to the rest of Minnesota passes through Canada, or the Mohawk territory of Akwesasne, which spans parts of New York, Ontario, and Quebec, a community whose traditional homeland predates the modern international boundary. Leaving residents to navigate a border that cuts directly through land their ancestors occupied long before the line existed. Canadian authorities have acknowledged the burden this creates and have built special arrangements to make routine crossings for school, work, and healthcare easier for the people who live there. These aren't obscure footnotes. They're everyday life for thousands of people who live not simply on one side of a border, but inside its contradictions. Here's one most Americans have never heard. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the most powerful men in American history, had a beloved summer home that sits on foreign soil. Campobello Island lies just off the coast of Maine, but it belongs to Canada, part of New Brunswick. Efter's family had vacationed there since the 1880s, and it was on this island, in August of 1921, that Roosevelt suddenly fell seriously ill and was diagnosed with polio, the illness that would leave him paralyzed for the rest of his life, and that would ultimately reshape how he led a nation through depression and war. Today, an international bridge, named, fittingly, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial Bridge, connects the island directly to Lubec, Maine. But crossing it still means passing through Canadian customs. So even now, reaching an important piece of American presidential history requires, quite literally, entering another country first. Recognizing just how intertwined this place was with both nations, the United States and Canada did something remarkable in 1964. Through an international agreement, they created the Roosevelt Campobello International Park, a park jointly owned, jointly funded, and jointly staffed by both governments. It has few real equivalents anywhere else in the world. A single piece of land where two countries share not just a border, but ownership itself. It stands today as a quiet monument to something the modern world rarely sees. Two nations that decided cooperation was simply easier and more meaningful than drawing a hard line through a place that mattered to both of them. Head to the wilderness between Minnesota and Ontario, and the border stops looking like a line at all. It becomes water. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness and its Canadian neighbor, Quetico Provincial Park, together protect a vast, interconnected wilderness of lakes, rivers, and boreal forest spanning both sides of the border. Out on the water, the physical boundary can become almost invisible. A lake may look exactly the same on both shores, but crossing into Canada, even by canoe, still means crossing an international border, and paddlers are expected to follow Canadian reporting requirements for remote crossings, even out here, far from any checkpoint. Because fire and wildlife have never respected a line drawn on a map, the two countries have built systems over the decades for coordinating conservation and emergency response across this border, from wildlife management to search and rescue to responding when a wildfire crosses from one country's forest into the other's. It's a strange kind of poetry. In a place with almost no cell signal, no roads, and no people for miles, the border becomes something you have to remember as their proof that on the ground, nature was never divided the way maps insist it should be, even if the law still is. It's easy to assume this border was always calm, always friendly, the world's longest undefended border, as it's often called. But that phrase hides a more complicated history. In the 1850s, the US and Britain came dangerously close to war over this line, including the almost comically named Pig War of 1859.
Hey, get out of my garden! Go on now!
When a single pig, shot for eating an American farmer's potatoes on disputed San Juan Island, helped trigger a crisis that brought American and British forces face to face on the island. Soldiers dug in, warships were dispatched, and the entire standoff was resolved not by combat, but by nearly 12 years of joint military occupation, followed by international arbitration. The dispute was eventually submitted to Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany as arbitrator. A 3-member commission considered the case, and in 1872, the decision placed the San Juan Islands under American control. Then there's the Peace Arch, standing on the border between Washington State and British Columbia, built in 1921. Carved into its stone, children of a common mother, and on the Canadian-facing side, brethren dwelling together in unity. It was built specifically as a monument to a rare achievement in human history, over a century at that point, without a war between two neighboring nations sharing thousands of miles of open border. At Peace Arch Park, the border itself runs through the middle of a shared international park. Visitors can enter the park from either country without presenting a passport at the park entrance, but the area is monitored by both the United States and Canada, and visitors are still expected to carry identification and follow immigration law if asked. It remains one of the very few places on this border where the line between two nations feels less like a barrier and more like a shared piece of ground. Of course, this isn't the whole picture anymore. Since 2001, the US-Canada border has tightened in ways older generations on both sides never expected. Modern travel document requirements have replaced much of the informality that once characterized daily life in border communities. Though the exact rules still depend on your citizenship and how you're crossing. And in parts of the border where authorities consider it necessary, technology including cameras, sensors, and other surveillance systems now watches ground that, for 2 centuries, was monitored by no one at all. For towns like Derby Line, for families in Akwesasne, for the residents of Point Roberts, this shift hasn't been abstract policy, it's been personal. Crossings that once felt like stepping into a neighbor's yard now come with rules their grandparents never needed to think about. And yet even now, even with all of that, this remains, overwhelmingly, one of the most cooperative borders on the planet. 2 nations share roughly 5,525 miles of boundary, much of it running through forests, mountains, lakes, and remote wilderness rather than walls or fences. A line of tape in a library, a shared park built around a president's summer home, a stone arch inviting people to walk into a park that belongs to both countries at once. Maybe that's the real story here. Not a border defined purely by walls or guards or checkpoints, but one shaped, again and again, by the strange, practical, human choice of 2 nations to keep working things out with each other, town by town, treaty by treaty, even as the rules keep changing. A line drawn by surveyors 2 centuries ago, redrawn in small ways every year by the people who live along it, cross it, and build their lives around it. It's the longest border between 2 countries anywhere in the world. And somehow, it's also one of the strangest and most human places on Earth.